Welcome to Therapy in the Great Outdoors, a podcast about the business and practice of nature-based pediatric therapy of all kinds. If you are a nature-loving therapist who works with children, this podcast will help you start taking your work outdoors into nature and help you grow a profitable nature-based therapy practice or program that connects children to nature and changes their lives and yours forever. I'm your host, the ever honest, always 100% real, Laura Park Figueroa. I have been a pediatric occupational therapist for over 20 years. But 7 years ago, I almost left the field entirely. I was so burned out. And nature-based therapy is what saved me. It reignited my love of my work, and I saw profound changes in the children that I was working with. I'm the founder of Outdoor Kids OT and the creator of the TGO approach, an evidence-based framework for nature-based pediatric therapy services. I've helped dozens of pediatric therapists start and grow successful nature-based practices through my business coaching and online programs, the latest of which is the Therapy in the Great Outdoors community, TGO for short. TGO is an online membership site with loads of resources to support you every step of the way as you start and grow your nature-based therapy work. You can find out more at therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com. Working outdoors with children can be a wild ride. Are you ready for the adventure? Let's jump in. Welcome, everyone, to Therapy in the Great Outdoors. This episode, we are going to talk about birding and how you can use it as a therapeutic tool in your nature-based sessions with children. And I am so excited. One of my favorite people in the world is here, Freya McGregor. Her eyes just got really big, but it's true. She's an amazing human being. I love the work she's doing. And she just started her own consulting firm called Access Birding. And Access Birding provides consulting and training services to empower staff and volunteers at nature organizations to become confident agents of change. I love that. Who improve access and inclusion for disabled birders. So what you're going to learn today is that we are going to provide you with a new tool, birds and birding. You may not know much about it. You're going to know a lot after this episode. Birds and birding to use in your practice, a new tool to use in your practice, and perhaps encourage you to keep thinking outside the box about what we as pediatric therapists can do and how we can use our skills and our approaches in non-traditional ways in our sessions with children. So welcome, Freya. Tell us all about Access Birding and what else you have going on. You're doing a lot in this area right now.
Yeah. Hi, Laura. Thanks so much. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to share more about birding with fellow therapists. I am an occupational therapist by training, originally from Australia, but I live in the US now. Just started Access Birding, but prior to this, I co-founded a nonprofit called Birdability, which is all about sharing the joys of birding with people who have disabilities and other health concerns. I'm a disabled birder as well as an OT, and there are just so many benefits that we can get from birding, because birds can be that gateway into tapping into nature and all those health and wellness benefits that we can get. I'm a research associate at Virginia Tech, involved in projects related to disability, inclusion, access, and birding, and using birds as a therapeutic tool. And I'm also writing a book that will be published by Princeton University Press in a couple of years. It's going to be a travel guide about accessible birding in North America. So there's lots of bird travel books that tell folks how to find birds in different places, the hotspots, where different species are in different regions. But most of them, like most websites of state parks and nature centers, just don't include the level of detail of accessibility information that many disabled folks need to know if it's worth hiking out there to have a successful visit. And so I'm going to be reviewing 3 to 5 birding locations in every state and Canadian province about places that have really fantastic accessible features, bird blinds, observation decks, trails, but you don't have to bird by a trail. Car birding is a whole thing. And places that have birding spectacles where there's 15,000 sandhill cranes spending the winter in this one spot, or like specialty birds that only live in that little area, or birds that like painted buntings, these really brightly colored birds that are in the like in Texas and along the Gulf Coast. And a lot of people who aren't from that area really want to see a painted bunting because they're bright and beautiful. And
Yeah.
so that's a really fun project. And I hope it will help a lot of different folks get into birding and explore more places, because birding can be a reason to go exploring and find more about the world and your place in it. And that's a great thing too.
Yeah. Birds are so magical. They just have a very, I think kids are very attracted to them too. Like they're very interested in them, and especially those bright ones that are pretty. All of us kind of, my favorite are like the really bright yellow ones, and the cardinals, of course, here in Wisconsin. But anyway, I digress talking about my favorite birds.
But that's the thing, right? Everyone has a bird story. Birds have outrageous feathers. They make all kinds of weird noises, and they can fly, and they're everywhere, even in the biggest cities. And so even in Antarctica, so everyone can connect to birds in some way or another. And everyone has a story about a bird that they've seen, or a story in their family about a bird, or a cultural association with a different bird. Like everyone can connect to birds. And so that can be such a cool hook to pull people into nature in general.
Yeah. And it's really this idea of, one of the things that came up in my research, and I know is prominent in other kind of conversations I've had with other therapists and other people that do nature-based work with children, is this idea of noticing, of just taking the time to notice. Because I think for me, before I really started doing nature-based work with children, I didn't even really notice the nature around me. Like I didn't notice the plants, the animals, the weather. Like you just kind of are living daily life. And I think for those of us who enjoy birding, enjoy the outdoors, we forget that people actually live life and don't even notice the things around them. And I think birding is such a great way to elicit that mindful noticing. It attracts kids' attention, and for a moment helps them kind of to drop into a way of noticing and kind of being calm and still to notice what's going on with that bird, if they're doing something unique, or if it's really pretty bird or interesting, doing some interesting behavior. Like it's just, I think that's a key piece. And in pediatric therapy with children is helping kids start to notice. It's like foundational to so many life skills. And I see birding as like a really great tool for that. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, because there's so many different species of birds. I don't even remember the number. It's like 600 and something species that are regularly found in the United States. There's more than 10,000 species in the world, and they all do different things. They all have different behaviors. They all have different plumage. They all make different sounds. And so, there's so much to notice, and different birds might travel in flocks. Some might be hanging out more as individuals. Some might be aggressive. Some might be like really cute. Like there's so many things, characteristics to point out. And mindful birding is a whole thing. It's
interesting.
Really getting a big, like, strong movement. I'm part of the Mindful Birding Network, and this idea of using birds as a mindfulness tool, because they're all over the place and they do all sorts of things. And if you can slow down and tap into them, and just like use that as a way to chill out. There's a bunch of books on them. One really fantastic one, which might be really helpful for therapists looking to use birds, is called Therapy. Holly Merker is an art therapist and a really big birder, and she had breast cancer and discovered how good it was to go birding, going through chemo and big, scary life experiences, and that birds grounded her and helped her like want to keep going through such a tough thing. And so she does a lot of work around this idea of mindful birding, and she's the one who started the Mindful Birding Network, and she's very, very cool. So Therapy is a great book. So there's a whole lot of explorations, like exercises to do using birds as a mindfulness tool in that book. And it would be really easy to incorporate them into a pediatric nature session.
So when you say, I just want to spell it for people in case they're not familiar with the term, it's ornithotherapy. So ORNITHERAPY, right?
Yep. And
Because
it's by
ornithography is birds. What's the word that it's based on? I know the word, I just don't know. It's like a Latin root, isn't it?
ornithology
Ornithology, yeah.
is the study
And
of
that's
birds.
like the study of birds. Yeah. Okay.
Like
So
botany
now that
is the
we
study of plants.
exactly. It's just a harder word to say. I'm like ornithology. Okay. All right. This is why I'm a great interviewer, is because I have no problem admitting my own ignorance when it comes to like certain things I'm interviewing people about. And I'm just so curious and love to ask questions. So it's like I am right there with the listener if they didn't know the phrase and what exactly ornithology was. So, okay, let's dive into talking about, like, you had written me on this form I gave you before our interview here, that there are different styles of birding that you can use in nature-based therapy sessions. So I think let's talk about that. And then also you had written adaptive birding equipment, and maybe I think getting into the styles of birding first might make sense, and then dive into how we can adapt different styles for different types of kids, maybe.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, mindful birding is a really big style of birding, using a spot, tuning into the same birds that come if you have a feeder in the like a bird feeder in the place that you're doing therapy or not, birds are around anyway, and using that as a grounding, calming sort of like, we're just going to hang out and watch the birds for 5 minutes before we, go into the rest of the session. There's By styles of birding, there's so many different ways to enjoy birds. So birding by ear is a whole thing because birds make noise and different species make different noise, and you can identify birds by the sounds they make. It's awesome. So my clinical background is in blindness and low vision services, and bird watching, just that word, culturally, like a lot of folks are like, well, of course someone who's blind can't be a bird watcher. Yeah, well, but what if you don't call it bird watching? What if you just call it birding? Because of course folks who are blind or have low vision can enjoy birds by ear. Lots of sighted bird is bird by ear, because often you'll hear a sound and you'll turn it like, oh, who's making that noise? And you turn around and look for it. I'm not like someone who's very, very good at birding by ear. There's people who have much better auditory skills in that than me. But the research suggests that part of what makes birding therapeutic and helps restore like attentional capacity and things like that is that for most of us, it's a multisensory experience. They make noise and they look cool. So birding by ear, of course, if you are sighted, bird watching, looking at birds and what they're doing and how they behave and what patterns they have and all of that. Quote unquote listing is a style of birding, like within the birding community, where people keep a list of the birds that they've identified, like today, while they've been out for an hour on a hike, or they might have a yard list and how many birds they've seen for the whole year in their backyard, or many folks have a life list and how many species in total they've ever seen or heard. Listing, some people get really this is within the birding community, some people can get like obsessed with listing, and that becomes the focus. And if you haven't seen more than 50 species today on this bird outing you're on, like, it's kind of a fail because it wasn't like how many like it gets a bit, and it can get a bit competitive. And this mindful birding movement right now is sort of trying to push back against that. Like that's not the only way to enjoy birds. And just because you might only see one species, but you spent 20 minutes just hanging out with that bird, that doesn't make it any less valuable than someone who got 100 species in a day, which is a lot in a day. 100 that's a lot of species in it. But
I think 10 would even be a lot. That's like crazy, 100.
Sure, right. Like, it's all relative, right? And maybe it's not quantity, maybe it's quality. But it could be a fun thing to, like, okay, guys, let's see how many different bird species we can identify today. And it becomes a treasure hunt. And in a therapy session, like, how fun is a treasure hunt?
That is one thing. That I have found that kids love. It's always like the hunt, like looking for something hidden, a treasure hunt, a scavenger hunt, like whatever it is, like the hunt of looking for it, like hiding supplies even, and then having kids go look for them. And so the idea of like a bird hunt is kind of a fun, like, to see how many you can find, not like hunt and kill, but
I know, but that's part of for many of us birders, like, that's part of the joy, is you don't know because no one actually hid them before. So like you're not like, hey, are we looking for 10 or 12? Like you don't know what's going to show up.
Yeah.
And different times of day, different seasons. A lot of birds migrate south in the winter where it's warmer and there's more food.
Yeah.
So there's different birds around all the time, and you don't know what you'll find. And that's part of the joy, like that sense of discovery and excitement, and also the appreciation of like what did present itself for you on that day. Like, how cool was that, you know? So, yeah, in the birding community, you'd call it listing, but in a therapy session, maybe you'd call it a treasure hunt. Like, you know,
yeah, that's great.
Can we find 10 species and we'll, you know, do a little quarter-mile walk? And it'd be really easy. There's lots of like laminated like brochures with common backyard birds or common birds in the northeast or wherever. And so you could have a couple of those that the kids have to help them. It's not like a big heavy duty field guide that has all the field marks and it's really huge, that like it's overwhelming. Like, you know, a laminated brochure could be really helpful like that. Car birding is a thing. Birds don't seem to recognize that a car could contain a human. And and a human could be a threat. You know, a lot of birds, you know, won't let you get that close to them, but they don't sort of mind a car. And so there's lots of national wildlife refuges that have like wildlife drives that might be a few miles long past fields and wetlands and whatever. And you can get close to birds who just keep going about their business without minding you in a car. And I mean, maybe that's not in a therapeutic session, but maybe that's with your kids at home. Like,
yeah, you know, or to tell parents to try if you find out that there's a place near you where they could see them. I mean, that's an easy ask for parents to like take a little drive with your child down by this wetland where you can see this certain species or whatever, you know, like I think the more that we can incorporate nature and make parents or caregivers and children enjoy nature together, I think the better, you know, so that's a great idea.
Yeah. And country roads, you know, driving along like next to paddocks and, you know, power lines, look on power lines. There might be hawks and kestrels like perched on power lines looking for food in the fields, and on different bird species on the like fences. And, you know, wind the windows down because you might hear stuff that you wouldn't if the windows were up. And but have a look if there's a national wildlife refuge nearby. A lot of them will have this wildlife drive, and that could be a really fun outing. And there's usually they'll have a trail or two here and there, and so you can, you know, get out and stretch your legs, and it's good fun. There's lots of ways to find birds. And then of course backyard birding or at a nature center or somewhere where there's feeders set up. And so the birds are used to coming to this place because they're getting an easy meal, and so you can just like hang out there and see what shows up and get kind of reliable views. You know, you should expect to see a few different species, and different species come to different feeders. Different species prefer, you know, sunflower seeds over like suet, which is like really like almost like peanut butter, like a really fatty content. Hummingbird feeders, you know, that's a totally different feeder with like sugar water in it. That's a great way to get kids' attention, because there's going to be a lot of activity at the feeders if the birds are around, like lots going on. And which birds are more dominant over each other? Like what happens when the blue jay shows up? And, you know, and because the same birds will probably come back a few times, then the kids can start getting used to the different species and identifying them if you want to. But this is a big secret about birding. There's a big emphasis in the birding community about identifying birds and knowing what they're called and being quick about calling out the name. But you know what? The birds don't care if you call them something else. Like, make up names. How fun is that? Like, get the creative juices flowing. Great. Like, a blue jay, I mean, it's blue. It is definitely a very blue bird. But like, what other kind of incredible name could kids make up about this bird based on what they observe it doing?
Yeah. There's a quick story, and I feel I want to share it, but I feel bad because I can't exactly remember the origin of it. But it was at a nature-based kind of educational training I went to in Seattle last year, I want to say. And there were, you know, it was all people who work like in forest school or like kind of wilderness type survival training education with kids. And one of the guys shared a story of a young kid who was very enamored by this bird that they were seeing, and an instructor, an adult that was with them, maybe a teacher, I don't really remember the context, but a teacher said, "Oh, that's just a robin."
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And kind of dismissed the idea that like, oh, because we see it so commonly, like it's no big deal. It's just a robin. That's no big deal. And the person sharing the story was saying how like, imagine the difference that would have had on the child if the adult had kind of shared that sense of wonder about the bird or asked questions about like, what do you think he's doing? You're like just kind of being in the moment with the child rather than dismissing
Oh
with
yeah.
this need to just like name it and claim it and get out, like, so it just
Right.
was an interesting story to me that I've always kept in mind. Anytime I see a robin now, I actually think about it. And I kind of, I have a greater sense of wonder because of that story to like
Mm-hmm.
notice robins when I see them,
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting.
It's easy, I think, for humans to get complacent about things that are common in their life
Mm-hmm.
and regular occurrences. And
Yeah.
it's not interesting anymore because it's expected, and
Yeah.
that's, I mean, that mindful birding thing, right, is pushing back on that too within this idea of, oh, it's just insert common bird name
Yeah.
here. Like, and
Yeah.
that happens a lot, like out on a trail with it. There's lots and lots of organized bird outings all over the US, lots of bird clubs and Audubon chapters and things who hold regular bird outings, or maybe you're just out on a trail and you see someone else birding, because
Mm-hmm.
45 million Americans are birders. So there's a lot of people out there who might be enjoying this hobby. And there's a lot of that. I call it like bird snobbery. Like, oh, it's just
Yeah.
have you seen any good birds? I don't really like that question, because what do you consider a good bird?
Right.
I'm a military spouse. I've lived in 4 states in the US in 7 years. The birds that I was used to seeing in San Antonio, Texas, like painted buntings, we moved to Boston, and the things that were considered good birds in New England were very different than the ones in San Antonio. And
Hmm.
anyone in Boston would have, like, they would have been thrilled, this painted bunting, right? And I was seeing them all the time in Texas. It wasn't
Yeah.
excessively exciting, as in
Right.
if you only valued novelty.
Yeah.
But yeah, this idea too of, we all have a circle of influence, and it might not be big, but we
Mm.
all touch other people, and you can share enthusiasm and you can spark excitement, or you can crush it really quickly. And
Yeah.
it's so easy, instead of just brushing something off that someone else is excited about, like, yeah, why not be like, hey, yeah, it's a robin, isn't it cool? Like, have you noticed that they hop and then they seem to listen to the ground? What do you think they're listening for? Like,
Yeah.
imagine what else you could, like you said, what else you could inspire in a sense of discovery, in just
Yeah.
general interest in nature and birds in the world. Like, we can do great things with the people we interact with.
Yeah.
Hopefully we do great things, and then
Yeah.
don't
And
harm
that like
people.
forms, that's part of, I think, a child really forming those. I was just thinking as you were talking about the familiarity, right, of certain birds. Like I will never grow tired of cardinals, and the little pair of
Mm-hmm.
cardinals that are like in my backyard.
Mm-hmm.
I see them all the time. And as we're having this conversation, I'm like, it's snowing 6 inches outside right now, and all my bird feeders are empty. I need to go to the store today. Like, because we're talking, and I've noticed they're not here as much because I don't have food for them in the feeders. They went empty a little bit ago and I haven't filled them yet. But I won't get tired of seeing them. I love seeing them because I feel a sense of connection with these animals that I'm seeing all the time in my backyard. And I wonder if that's possible for kids too,
Oh,
that
for
like
sure.
we're seeing these it's similar, you're probably going to see, no matter where you're doing nature-based work, whether you're out on a school ground, on a playground, or if you're out in the woods with kids or at the beach, you're probably going to see similar birds each time. And for those kids, that is actually an opportunity to form a real connection and understanding and like a deeper relationship with the natural world. So I think it's those commonplace birds might actually be a window into like more nature connection, maybe. I mean, I don't know,
Oh,
I'm just
absolutely.
pontificating here. I don't know if any of this is based in fact, but like
No,
just
it is.
thinking
It
about
is.
it.
I was reading a research paper this morning actually about
Awesome.
the likability of different bird species that people feed in their backyards. Not every bird
Mm,
comes to backyard feeders. Only a certain number are interested in being that close to people and eating that kind of
yeah.
food. But yeah, for sure. And I mean, any like expert birder will tell you, when you start birding, get familiar with what's near you. Like get familiar with what makes up a cardinal. What shape is its beak? What sounds do they make? Like, are they ever by themselves or in flocks, or are they usually in a pair? What's the tail shape? What are they, kind of fat, or are they kind of slender? All of those things. How do they fly? Some birds glide, like hawks and eagles, and some birds, woodpeckers, fly with this really interesting sort of undulating flight. They like drop down and come up and drop down and come up, like they kind of like make a big wave as they're flying between trees. And so if you know that and you see a bird flying like that and like disappear into a tree, you could probably have a pretty good guess that's a woodpecker, because you've tuned into how the patterns that they make when they fly. At any rate, learning the birds that are close to you, that are common where you are, that's the way in, because then you start, when you meet another bird that you haven't interacted with before, you'd be like, hey, that bird's beak is different. It's not a triangle like a cardinal, and it's not a funny little pointy bit like a nuthatch. It's even longer, and it like hangs down, and their legs are really long. And you start to notice the things that make something different because you're familiar with a few birds already. If it can feel a bit overwhelming at the start of like getting into birding, because there are so many different birds, and like like there's just so much. But just start with what's close by, and you'll get hooked before you know it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too. I wanted to circle back to what you said about the laminated card, like kind of I have those like for here in Wisconsin and also in California. I actually give all of my employees it's just maybe like it's a little brochure. It's laminated. Every nature center in any area in the United States, at least, will have these for whatever area it's in, right? It's like Wisconsin birds, California birds, Northern California birds, like you can get these and I love them. I love that you mentioned them, because they are much less overwhelming for the types of kids that we typically work with in therapy outdoors, right? They tend to some of them have visual perceptual challenges. Some of them have visual motor challenges. Some of them are just overwhelmed, overstimulated by a lot of visual information. And so I like those little folded laminated brochures because they're not as overwhelming for the kids that we work with. You can isolate, like, okay, let's find it in here. I'm going to give you a clue. It's on this page. Can you find it? Can you match it to the one that we just saw? And then it's building their visual perceptual skills, but in a way that is like fun. Like they actually, it's like that treasure hunt, kind of like finding out which one it is or finding it on the page. So I have used those and I highly recommend them. I love them. And they're also very lightweight to keep in a backpack compared to like a full Audubon guide for your area.
Yeah, for sure. Going backwards just a second, bird feeding. So at Virginia Tech, the social scientist that I work with, she does a lot of research around bird feeding and why people feed birds and how they connect to birds through bird feeding. Really interesting stuff. And some folks, they feel like a sense of care and compassion for birds, and that's why you sort of expressed just before a little bit of guilt, maybe, that the birds who maybe are relying on you for food aren't being fed. It's actually fine. The evidence says that birds are fine if you like go away on holiday or you forget or it snows or whatever. The birds are fine. They're fine. It's just that they're coming to you because it's the easiest thing. But if it's not there, they can find their own food. So don't worry about that. But this research I was reading this morning was about people. They found there was 300 and something participants in the UK, and they found that people who fed birds felt more connected to nature. That was just absolute finding.
That's great,
right? So like this is birds have power, and because the other thing too, from a conservation perspective, the more people we can encourage to care about nature, the more people will be protecting it, right? And planting all these seeds through nature-based therapy is such a cool thing. But something else you said about some of the kids that you might be working with, I'm good friends with a birder who has chronic Lyme disease, and so she's got lots of fatigue and like pain issues, and she has ADHD, which kind of create two like polar opposite kind of access challenges to go birding. But she says that ADHD is a birding superpower. And I love that so much because, and I know I'm friends with a few autistic birders and has a special interest, there is so much you can dive into with birds. We don't know everything there is to know about birds. There's ornithologists all over the world studying birds. Like there's so much to learn, and there's so many things to like discover on your own. And what a cool thing to like get excited about. And my friend with ADHD, she said because she's like really alert to what's going on, you know, any bird movement in a bush or a tree or something, like she is on it, and she is like picking up birds left, right, and center. And then she'll go home and be like, well, I saw this goldfinch do this thing, and I like, she'll dive right into like finding out more about that. And I think that's so cool, and such a great way to use like a strengths-based approach to therapy. You know, that different disabilities or diagnoses or challenges that kids have, they don't have to be bad. They can be a strength, and birds can help us find them.
Yes. I love this. I love where this conversation is going. And I think this is so important for us to think about as well, you're not a pediatric therapist, but as this podcast is for pediatric therapists. So like as pediatric therapists, I think it's really important for us to think about different ways to offer nature-based services. And several years ago, I chatted with Meg Proctor a little bit. So if people don't know her, I can't imagine that people listening to this podcast don't know her, but she's a big advocate for autistic people. Like that her whole entire business is centered around helping therapists understand the learning styles of autistic people. And I talked with her about wanting to make sure that my practice was using strengths-based approaches that were like friendly to the autistic community, because, you know, a lot of what we knew in the past, and this is a long rabbit hole, this could be a whole podcast, but like a lot of what we thought in the past about working with people with autism is very different now, right? And one of the things we talked about, which I'm happy to say that she pretty much was like, Laura, what you're doing is what you're supposed to be doing, like offering social experiences for kids, teaching perspective taking, you know, like those kind of things are good, but like forcing kids to like sit on their hands so they don't flap, or like tell them quiet hands, that's not good, right? So it's good to learn about these things. So I think her account is Learn, Play, Thrive on Instagram. Anyway, what came up in that conversation was one of the ways that she mentioned, she's like, Laura, have you ever done leisure groups for like middle school or teens, like autistic middle schoolers or teenagers, right? And I was like, well, we don't really work with those ages, but that's an interesting concept. And one of the things that came up was like finding kids' interest, right? Like finding a group of middle school kids who are interested in birding, and birding being like the leisure activity that the entire group is focused around, rather than kind of using the approach we use now in my practice is like, it's a social group. Like we do some activities together and the kids have some free time to play in nature while we support them with social and motor skills. So there's not really like a outdoor leisure activity that is kind of binding everyone together. So in a similar way, hiking clubs or rock climbing clubs or birding clubs, things like that, like to have that really be like a strengths-based approach of like, they're just having opportunities to be in an autistic friendly space with other kids that have autism, and like it to be kind of like just a fun time for them to engage in this leisure activity. So I love that you're talking about that strengths-based approach, because that is something that I've wanted to explore in my practice and haven't had bandwidth to like get going because we're so tiny. And, you know, I'm also doing a PhD, so I have to get that done before I try to do anything else in my businesses. But I love that strengths-based approach. And I think birding could be a great leisure occupation for kids.
Oh, for sure. There's lots of Audubon chapters, and there's like 400 and something Audubon chapters in the US, and lots of different bird clubs and state ornithological societies. And there's always a strong emphasis on young birders and supporting young birders and helping young birders get into birding and you know, they're the future, right, of the profession or the hobby. There would absolutely be potential for therapists to reach out to local birding organizations and ask if there are young birders around, and if there was like a partnership opportunity where maybe the therapist who's doing like a leisure club related to birding would also like advertise with that that birding organization or something like
Yeah.
that. My observation of some of the young birding work can be that there can be a lot of young folks there who quite wealthy, whose families are quite wealthy, and they might have very expensive binoculars or very expensive cameras, and that can feel a little intimidating. So just know that that's not true for everybody, for sure. But it's when there's like a 14-year-old with like a $15,000 camera setup, like I just noticed that.
Yes, it stands out.
It stands out, and you know, this actually, that's an interesting segue into equipment, right? And I'm really passionate about making birding more inclusive and accessible to, particularly to disabled birders, but to anybody. And you know, intersectionality is a thing, and what barriers are there, and what social and cultural barriers are there into birding. And so often people think that you have to have binoculars to go birding, and I strongly disagree with that. They're a tool. They're really helpful. I use them a lot, sure, because they make the bird look closer, and so you get more detail, and you can kind of enjoy them intricately, but they're just a tool. Even when I don't have binoculars, you can't tell me that I'm not birding when I'm out enjoying a bird. Right. Like, my definition of a birder is someone who enjoys birds. So you don't need to have any qualifications to do that. You don't need to own binoculars. You don't need to have seen a certain number of species or you know, be like really quick at IDing them or any of that stuff. You just enjoy birds, and then you're a birder. And that just that I've done a bit of work within the birding community about that concept, what birding is, and it makes so many more people feel so much more included, because there was this previous like unspoken idea that you had to somehow qualify to call yourself a birder. But where did that come from? And as OTs, here's a super non-traditional use of occupational therapy. What can I do to change the cultural environment of this activity to make it more welcoming and inclusive? And the easiest thing, I think, is to use the word birder instead of birdwatcher, because then we're not unintentionally perhaps excluding some folks who don't use vision much or at all when they're enjoying birds, and we're just making it even playing field that anyone can just join like that. But binoculars, yes, they're a tool, they're not required. So, you know, if you want to get kids in therapy sessions interested in birds, you don't need to have like 10 pairs of binoculars. That's cost prohibitive for sure. Like, there might be lots of bird clubs and things, they'll have a set of loaner binoculars, and maybe you could borrow them, or maybe if you're doing your sessions at a nature center or something, they might have some, you know, the education folks might have some binoculars you can borrow, and that's fine. It's fun to learn a new tool, but you don't need to have binoculars to take folks birding, like, not at all.
Right. Or maybe one pair for a group, you know, like you buy one and then you share them.
Yeah.
Now that hopefully we're over COVID, right? Like, we can share stuff again.
And maybe some people have binoculars at home. Maybe their parents are birders. Like, sure, bring yours if you've got them, but don't worry about it. Like, it's not required. And some people can't use binoculars. They're too heavy. They can't steady them. Maybe there's a tremor. Maybe that visual processing, like having stuff magnified, could be like really trippy. I know folks who have difficulty with fine motor skills, and so the focal knob, like the thing in the middle that you twist to make the bird come into focus, could be different pairs of binoculars have different design features, but most of them, they have really skinny, like thin lines to like help you grip. But if you have fine motor difficulties, or I was working with a gentleman who had MS, and he said, it feels like I wear leather gloves all day, every day. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. But
he couldn't feel it. Yeah.
Right. So he just didn't bother with the binoculars. I mean, that's fine, unless you want to use the binoculars. So
right.
And then, I mean, this might not apply to many kids that folks are working with, but my husband is in the army. He has PTSD, and it took me, and I like a little bit professionally embarrassed about this, it took me years to figure out why he was so reluctant to look through my binoculars. Reluctant, like it'd be like, please, it's an indigo bunting, they're like bright, like sparkling blue all over, they're so beautiful. I'm like, please just have a quick look, like it's such a pretty bird. And he'd like glance and be like, yep, cool, I can see it. And it turns out someone gave him a monocular, which is like a single eyepiece basically, and he loved it. And we were like, okay, what's the deal? Well, in the army, you're trained to shoot with both eyes open. And when you use night vision, you have the optics on one eye and the other eye is open. And that gives you more visual information about your surroundings, because binoculars severely reduce your peripheral vision.
Yeah.
And as we discovered quickly, once he had the binocular, he felt really vulnerable being outside.
Yeah.
Having his peripheral vision cut off that much, and he just wasn't comfortable. And a monocular meant he could keep the other eye open, and that was
yeah.
fine.
I didn't even know monoculars were a thing that you could do, because I actually don't like binoculars. I mean, not because of PTSD, but that's a very interesting, like it's an interesting story that illustrates how disabilities are not always overtly obvious on a person's body, their physical body, right? Like I'm hearing impaired, and a lot of times people don't think about people that are hearing impaired, right? In like any situation in life. So like it's kind of an invisible quote unquote disability. And it's a good story you shared, that we kind of can't make assumptions. We always kind of have to be digging for what is the for kids, especially, like what could engage this kid more? What's the underlying need that underlies any behavior or discomfort they have with something in a session, right? Because with kids, you even have to dig further. You can't really, sometimes they can't communicate about what it is really, right? So
yeah, well, I mean, this was years of birding together, right? And he never said, I don't feel comfortable because my peripheral vision's cut off. He didn't realize that was what it was. It was only once we changed up the equipment, and as it turns out, we were now using adaptive birding equipment, that I was like, wait, let's analyze the equipment and the task. What's changed? And he's he's happy to talk about it with me, but it's not just something that he was aware of. Even he wasn't even diagnosed with PTSD when we figured this out. That's a more recent discovery. But so binoculars you don't need, but they can be handy. Monoculars, often not shown in birding. Everyone's using binoculars, but if you don't know that it's an option, then you don't know you can. Hunters tend to use monoculars because they're lighter weight, and I don't know. And if you're shooting with both eyes open, then maybe it's more natural to you. I don't know. I'm not a hunter, but there's all kinds of adaptive birding equipment too. Like, lots of folks have scopes, like spotting scopes, like a telescope. They have much more magnification, so you can zoom in on the birds a lot more, and they're heavy. You have to have them mounted on a tripod or on a mount that you like attach to your window because you're car birding, and because they're so magnified that if you handheld them, you would just be shaking like crazy and you wouldn't be able to see anything much.
Right.
But you can get mounts that to help like mount a scope or a monocular or binoculars on a wheelchair or a scooter. Actually, I have a capstone student coming at the start of 2023, and he's going to be doing focus groups and interviews with birders who use mobility equipment to find out what properties are most important for wheelchair or scooter mounted scopes or optics, which is going to be really interesting, because that's just not a thing that the general birding community is talking about, but it could be really helpful for all kinds of folks. There's even, chairs and stools, really helpful for lots of people who have mobility challenges. I have a dodgy knee. I consider myself a disabled birder, and standing is much harder for me. I can stand, but not for very long. And sometimes when you're birding, you kind of get stuck in one spot because you're watching all this great stuff going on. But I really would rather sit down, because there's only so much of that I can do at once, or in a day, or in a week. And so benches are really helpful for me in nature settings, but I can also BYO chair sometimes.
Yeah. So on the flip side of that, with kids, I was just thinking about a story that I thought of earlier, but I didn't want to interrupt you were describing all the great styles of birding, and I didn't want to interrupt you. So on the flip side, with children that I have worked with before, like kids who have ADHD and autism, like those are the primary populations we serve in my practice, and that I worked with when I was doing nature-based work with kids. Like they almost are the opposite, where they will not sit still, right? Like they don't want to sit, they want to move. And so one of the things that my son and I did one night here in Wisconsin was we tracked an owl, because we heard the noise. We walked out in our backyard. We saw it, right, kind of nearby. And then we stood there in awe of it and watched it for a while. And then it flew to another tree. And then we kind of walked and followed it to another tree. And then it flew to our little local park nearby. And we walked down to the local park. And we actually could get pretty close to it and really see it. It was a baby. So it was making these really kind of scratchy, cryy noises, not like the typical barred owl that you see, like the grown owl, which has a really pretty kind of hoot. And it made me think of like with kids in sessions, like assuming kids are like the super active kind of kids that need to move a lot, you actually might take your birding on the move, right? Instead
Birds.
of forcing them to kind of sit and observe, like take it on the move, like, and they're still noticing, they're still being taught to notice and watch and like direct their attention towards wherever that bird is going. So it's just thinking, I love this conversation, like thinking about how to adapt the activity of birding to all different kinds of people.
Right.
That it's accessible. It can be made accessible for almost anyone. It's such a great thing.
Isn't it cool? And there's so much emphasis in like the outdoor kind of community on intense, like super active, high adrenaline activities, even like using nature as a therapeutic tool. I'm a mill spouse. We've been through that. There's lots of like really great nonprofits. I'm not dismissing this at all. Doing like programs for veterans with PTSD, and like they're like out in the wilderness and like hiking for like 8 days, and right,
or like whitewater rafting.
Yeah, right. And there's nothing bad about that. I've been whitewater rafting's loads of fun, but not everyone wants that. And I can tell you that my husband with PTSD does not actually want an adrenaline fueled activity at the moment. He wants to kind of be calm and like chill and like just relax. And yeah, you can make birding whatever you want it to be. And you could make it an adrenaline fueled activity. Chasing is when like a rare bird for your area shows up. And because birds fly and there's like wind and like hurricanes and stuff, and birds like show up in places that they shouldn't, but they do because they're birds. And isn't that cool? And so chasing, you can like sign up for a rare bird alert. And oh my gosh, there's like a common cuckoo, which is not common in North America. Some names of birds are weird. It's the European cuckoo. They're like cuckoo clock cuckoo. Showed up in Rhode Island like a year. This is the best example I can think of, a year ago. And it stayed for like a week. And so many people just they chased this bird, and it stayed in the same spot, which is helpful for all the people who want to see it. And everyone's like super excited, like, wow, the common cuckoo, right? All the Europeans are like, what's so special about that? But
right.
You can make it an adrenaline activity if you want to. There's plenty of people who love that chase because they're adding to their life list, and that excitement is something that they thrive on. And you can that's what is so cool about birding. It's so adaptable. It's so I bird in all kinds of different styles depending on what I'm doing and how I'm feeling. And like you don't have to be one or the other. You can do whatever you want. It's really awesome.
Yeah.
And when you said about the barred owl, so this is a fun activity that could be helpful in a therapy session because birds make different sounds. Their mnemonics are like a phrase that like helps you remember. This might not be the right definition of a mnemonic, but like a phrase that helps you remember something, like Roy G. Biv
I think that's right.
helps you remember the colors of the rainbow.
Yeah.
And so there's all these bird sound mnemonics, and some of them are really wacky. And some of them I've heard, like the first time I heard, I'm like, that is not what that bird sounds like. But then maybe a bit later, you're like, oh, I guess I actually, right behind me on my wall, I've got 2 posters from this really awesome bird and nature cartoonist called Rosemary Moscow, and she has posters of birds like saying their mnemonics, if that makes sense.
Okay.
It's really cute. It's kind of an in-joke. Like if you don't know what the bird sounds like, it doesn't make any sense. But barred owls, they say, who cooks for you? Who cooks
for you? Yeah.
And
say it again.
Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?
It's totally what they sound like.
Like I've seen an apron like in this quaint little gift shop, and it had a barred owl holding a wooden spoon with a chef hat on, and I was like, that is so fantastic. It was who cooks for you? Like he was the barred owl was the chef.
And the babies sound like wow.
Yeah.
like the babies are like this strange, it's like their voices haven't matured yet or something. I mean, that probably was not as good as your example of an adult barred owl, but they have a strange, it's like you don't think it's a barred owl because it's such a different kind of call. And we didn't really see, it's so interesting. We live next door to Bob, who is 98 years old. He's the oldest resident of our neighborhood that has lived here the longest, and he's the oldest. And he wrote us a lovely letter when we moved in, like a handwritten letter that his son brought over to us and dropped in our mailbox. And he told us in the letter that we'd be so happy here and, told us all about the neighborhood. And he wrote, there is a barred owl that comes and visits frequently in our backyards or whatever, because we're right next to each other. And sure enough, when we first moved in, we've been here a year and a half now. When we first moved in that first summer, we saw them all the time.
Mm-hmm.
All the time we saw them. They were in our front yard, our backyard. That's when my son and I tracked the one down to the, followed the one all the way down to the park by us. And then this year, we haven't seen almost any. I think I saw one once, an adult once, who was perched in this tree for a while. Some neighbors told us that they thought that it was a male, like guarding a nest. I guess they perch in a tree and then they keep eyesight over the nest somewhere in the woods further out or something. Then I haven't seen any babies. I haven't seen the mama. It's so sad to me. I miss them because they were like I love barred owls. They're like my favorite animal. I just love them. I love owls in general, but like the barred owl, especially just because it's like, it reminds me of home because they're near here, so it's just interesting how they ebb and flow, and it's a story about how, like, exactly what you said, like, you just never know what you're going to get when you do nature-based therapy in general, but with birding too, it's like this, it's always kind of this thing you can anticipate and not know what you're going to find, it's fun. It's fun for kids too.
Absolutely. And a lot of people get really emotionally attached to like their birds that come to their feeders. And absolutely. And so I just had a quick look. I need to talk about the Merlin Bird ID app as a tool, but I was just looking at bud owls.
I was going to ask you because I was like, I wonder if she knows. I know she knows about Merlin Bird ID. We have to share that with people. Yes. So tell people about that.
Well, before I do, I was just looking in case barred owls to see, because, lots of different species migrate, and I don't know if barred owls are year round in Wisconsin. I have no idea. So I just looked that up. Apparently they are, but that doesn't mean they're always going to, nest in the same spot every year, or maybe, birds don't live that long. Owls live longer than like little, like small songbirds, but some birds only live like 3 or 4 years, and that's it, So like things change, and that's sad and tough. But I mean, some birds like elicit community-wide emotions where like a piping plover is a plover. I'm Australian, so plover. Piping plovers are these little shorebirds, and they're really cute, and they run on little legs at the beach, and they're really gorgeous, and they're endangered. And a pair was nesting up in Chicago at this one spot that's a super big birding spot anyway in Chicago, Montrose Point Bird Sanctuary. And there's beach right there, and this pair nested for I think 2 years, and there hadn't been piping plovers nesting like anywhere nearby, like for decades. And like the whole community was like so thrilled, and they got Monty and Rose because it's Montrose.
Oh,
and like there was all this monitoring, like nest monitoring, and they put up this exclosure, which is a thing like a cage, but it's designed to keep things out, as in cats and raccoons that will go and eat the eggs because they're nesting on the beach, but the birds can run in and out, and it's no problem for the birds. And this summer, they didn't show back up, and they probably just got old and died. But like, people were heartbroken, like really legit.
It's
so
like it's birds, like sad kind of.
So birds connect people to nature in ways that I think, like some people love trees, and my sister's a botanist, but trees don't move, and they don't interact, and they don't like with each other or in the same. Well, there's research that says that they do, but not in a way that we can perceive. And birds have. I mean, there's all this research about why birds mean, like what meanings we ascribe to birds, cultural meanings, spiritual meanings, like all kinds of personal meanings, all kinds of stuff. But Merlin. Okay, so there's this great app that you should get because it's free and fantastic. It's called Merlin Bird ID. Merlin like the wizard, but actually it's Merlin like the raptor. It's a little falcon.
Merlin.
Right. And it's made by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is a really, really big bird research institution at Cornell University and upstate New York. And I use it like a field guide. Because I'm pretty familiar with most birds that I run into in any kind of regular way. And so I can just search by bird name and pull up the photos of the bird and the
Right.
description of and the range map and sounds. And you can play, if you play bird sounds outside, good birding ethics says to play them quietly, because you don't, especially in spring and summer, because you don't want to distract another bird that thinks it's an intruder on its territory, and they come and they come and see you, and they should be out doing their thing.
Right.
But you can play it quietly. You get the kids to like gather around and play it quietly. In winter and fall, it's less of a problem because the birds aren't nesting. But you can also use it. So there's two different neat things. One is this series of 5 easy questions to help you identify any bird that you've just seen. It asks you where you are, because range changes for species, the date, because it changes because birds migrate and stuff, size, relative size. So like, is it sparrow size or is it like crow size? And then like 3 colors that you saw, up to 3 colors, and then the behavior. So was it soaring or was it on the ground? Because some birds spend a lot of time on the ground. Some birds like hang out in tall trees, and then it will give you a list of the likely birds. And it's not always right. You've got to use some critical thinking sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's pretty good, and that's a neat tool. And then the other thing that Merlin can do, this is relatively new. There's a sound ID feature. And they say,
that's what I use.
I don't know if this is only American or if I'm too young, but apparently Shazam did this for songs, and this is Shazam for birds. I have been told. So like you like press go and like hold it up, and it records the sounds around you, and it will tell you what bird is making that noise. Now that's dependent on if you're next to a busy road and there's too much car, like it won't hear that. And if people are talking, like, it's not good audio quality. That's pretty fantastic. And that's, for me, that's been a really helpful tool to help reinforce learning birds by ear, because that's not something that I've like naturally, I know some birds by ear, but like, what is that again? I think there was a pine warbler the other day. They're here I'm in Alabama, they're here in the winter, and I think it's a pine warbler, and then it could confirm that for me. Like, I'm learning, and validation feels good.
Yeah, totally. I think for kids too, I think that's a good use of, like, a lot of times I think in nature-based work, most of us are trying to get kids off of screens, right? So we hesitate to kind of use a phone or something in a session, but this is, I would say that Merlin is an exception to that rule, because it really does, it could hook kids into birding, like by showing them, like they can select which one it is, and you're still connecting to the bird. You're still being forced to like visually or auditorily attend to what the bird is doing. And you're using technology as a way to connect kids to nature, right? Like it's different than kind of like a kid watching a video or something, like it's really an amazing tool. I love it. It's so much fun for me. Like when I'm out, if I hear something, I'm like, oh, I want to record it and find out what Merlin says it is. Because even if you can't physically see the bird, you can kind of identify what might be in the area and then know what to look for later. So it's a good tool, I think, for therapists to educate ourselves too about what birds are around you. Even if you're out on a hike, you're not leading a session right at that moment, but it helps you familiarize your own self with the birds that may be nearby that then you could tune children into when you're with them. So
for sure. And you said before that you're hearing impaired. And so birds, there's this thing called a spectrogram, which is like a visual representation of the sounds that birds make, because there's all these different qualities of bird sounds and they get represented differently. And when you're using the sound ID feature of Merlin, it kind of can look a bit crazy because there's all these other sounds. But if you look up that species and they've chosen like the best quality recordings as the sound for that individual species.
Yeah.
And you can see the spectrogram. And so for some folks who maybe can't hear, maybe the bird's too far away or it's too quiet, or some like little warblers, little songbirds, their calls can be a really high frequency. And that's the first thing to go with age. So maybe not the kids, but maybe the kids going out with their grandparents or something, high frequency hearing loss. And so you can show them, this is what I'm hearing, and like include someone who might be missing out. Like it's an adaptive tool. Like, and
I love it.
It's really awesome. Merlin also, you might not want to use the screens in therapy session, but that could be a tool you send home with parents, right? Like today we talked about birds. If you want to do this more with your kids, like here's a tool, because some parents might be maybe a little like they're not confident that they know enough about birds to want to pull their kids into birds. But hey, well, download this, it's free
Yeah.
and it's really awesome. And then maybe you guys can go explore birds as well.
Yeah.
Another thing that parents and kids could do outside of therapy, because there's so many bird and conservation organizations around, and there's so many ways to enjoy birds. There's also a lot of volunteer opportunities around. So those folks who are monitoring the piping plovers in Chicago, there's people who do nest box monitoring. Some birds nest in, like bluebirds are classic. They love nest boxes, and they'll put up folks will put up nest boxes, and they go around monitoring the nest boxes in the spring to see how many are occupied, how many eggs are there, how many of those eggs hatched, how many of those nestlings fledged, as in like graduated and left home.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of there's heaps of different ways you can volunteer with birds, and that's something that families can do together. And then you're also giving back to the community and to nature, and like, how good does that feel? And there's just so many ways to tap into birds. It's really awesome.
Yeah, it is. I'm so excited after this call. Actually, there's nesting boxes in the conservation area that's right, like my property, like my house is right on the border of a conservation area. So I walk into the trail like straight from the end of my driveway, and there's nesting boxes. I've never looked in them because I've never felt like I was allowed to, but like they're out there,
Yeah,
I've seen them. Yeah.
Yeah. Different species and people can put nest boxes up in their backyards, and house wrens, and in particular, they're little brown birds that have like a little pokey up tail. There's a few different wren species, but house wrens are famous for nesting in nest boxes in people's backyards. They don't seem to care. Same with Carolina wrens. They don't seem to care how close they are to people, as in like there's all kinds of reports of wrens building nests like in the back veranda, like in the Christmas wreath that you didn't take down yet, that's next to your front door that you walk in and out of every day. And you're like, what are you doing, bird? And the bird just doesn't care. Like, it's a cozy place. So funny. And they seem to like being around people. And so, yeah, there's all kinds of ways to invite birds into your backyard or your balcony if you don't have a backyard, or, you can enjoy birds out of window. You don't have to be out in the woods. Like, it's just such an accessible thing. And there's so much awesomeness about it.
Yes. I've loved this conversation. I feel like I do feel like this episode, when people listen to it, they're really going to, their wheels are just going to start turning about like ways that they can incorporate birds and birding into their work with kids. And it just makes me happy. I'm so excited. I love everything you shared. It was just so useful. So tell people where they can find you. Like, where do you hang out? Are you on social media? I know you are. And like, where can people find you?
Yeah, so I personally am on Instagram at the.ot.birder, because that's easier to read.
Right.
Increases accessibility. And then for Access Birding, my consulting and training business, on Instagram it's access.birding, Facebook there's Access Birding, and then my website there is accessbirding.com. And I also have a personal website, which is theotbirder.com. I've done a bit of freelance writing. So my published articles are up there about disability and access and inclusion in birding. And once this book gets out, and there's a few more projects in my mind. So that's apparently one must have an author website. So I haven't published a book yet, but I will. And
so I didn't know this.
I have a personal website too. Yeah, it all feels a bit surreal at this point, but I'm well on the way with that book. So that's not a like maybe one day. That's a currently happening. Like the contract's been signed, and that imposter syndrome is real, and I have to get used to referring to myself as an author apparently, and a business owner, also a new identity for me.
Yes. Well, it's so exciting though, right? Like you've really taken a passion. I mean, I think everyone who listens to this can hear your enthusiasm, and it's just infectious. I mean, I want to go outside now in 6 inches of pouring down snow and be like, I want to find the birds. Where are they? Like, because it's just your enthusiasm is so contagious. Like I'm just so excited about what you shared. And I think it's really cool to watch that you have been able to kind of start this career as like especially as an OT, I'm thrilled that you're an OT and you're like thinking contextually about changing context rather than changing the person, like that's how we need to be thinking, I think, in society. And I love that you've been able to like take this passion of yours and like make it into your life's work. It's just inspiring and I love it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think being from another country where OT is practiced a little bit differently, there's a lot more community-based OT, and my background was in community-based, blindness on the vision services, and I always wanted to do community-based work with disabled folks.
Yeah.
And then birding, I don't know, there was a lot of cards that just fell into place, but I think maybe because I'm not from here, I have this like vague, like, I can change the system because I like, who gives me that authority? But because maybe I'm from a different cultural context. There is cultural differences between Australia and the US, and so I see things a little differently, and maybe I can see this a little differently because I didn't grow up in this cultural environment. And I use the Canadian model of occupational performance is how I like do OT, and that whole like institutional, physical, social, and cultural environment, like that idea of having a circle of influence, like you can make change. And you might not have 65 million followers on Instagram. I sure don't, but like you are interacting with people all the time, and you can spread ideas and being enthusiastic. People, and this is that thing that story with the kid and the robin, like people catch enthusiasm, and people are excited about you being excited about stuff. And someone might be excited about something that I'm not excited about, but I'm excited that they're excited. And so now I'm, like it all just fuels, and it's really cool. OTs are trained. This is not dismissive of any other profession, but I'm only talking about
right. Of course,
I know, but OTs are trained to think out of the box all the time. We're always trained to problem solve and rearrange that jigsaw puzzle, and what can we shift so that we can get to this desired outcome. And my brain's always operated in this sort of public health, like top-down approach, like upstream thinking, kind of like, I can change something here, but can I go 3 steps backwards and change it there? Because then it will be fixed for everybody. And so it's kind of amazing that it's kind of bizarre, really, that I've created 2 different jobs for myself in this very specific niche that is very not a clinical traditional OT role, but absolutely is informed by my OT brain every step of the way.
Yeah.
It's really awesome. OT is so cool.
Yeah, I do. I love our profession. And I do think that the way you're thinking about just accessibility, inclusion, context. Like, I think a lot of times we get so in traditional pediatric practice, I should say, and I can't speak for other professions. I suppose I'm just speaking about OT right now because that's all I know. But we get very focused on like the individual, and we're not actually looking broader about like what can we change about context and about the other influences socially or the family or the school or the environment. Like, so that's what your work is all about. You're like taking that real, like higher view of things to change the context around people. It's strength-based, which is what we love.
And it doesn't feel like work because it's so fun. Like, and that's, that might be why using birds in nature-based therapy, like, or any nature-based therapy, it feels like fun. So it doesn't feel like work. Oh, and Laura, before we go, can I just say, I am in your Business Bedrocks program, which, I know you know that, but it is so helpful. Like, 4 months in, I think, and especially for someone who just started their own business, like, gosh, I've learned so much, particularly about marketing and marketing strategies and business systems. And it makes so much sense. And gosh, I've been incredibly overwhelmed in jobs before because I didn't have someone showing me what would be helpful. And it's so easy, but like you just need to know what to do. And when you're overwhelmed, you don't even know, like you don't even feel like you have the time to go and find out the solution. So if anyone's thinking about being in your Business Bedrocks course, like, gosh, it's so worthwhile. And it's so fun. Because I'm sort of embedded in the birding community rather than in a therapeutic setting, being in the therapy and the great outdoors community is just so nice to be surrounded by other OTs and therapists, and we're supposed to be in community, which is one of the great benefits of birding. You can tap into the birding community, but I also want to be in a community with other therapists. And so thank you for doing what you do and sharing what you know and teaching us all and helping us all, because for me in particular, it's been incredibly helpful and really, really wonderful to be part of.
I'm so glad. I love that work. It's like I love talking about business. It's my favorite topic besides nature and kids. I'm so happy to hear you say that, because you're one of the only people in there that isn't a pediatric therapist, right? And remember, I was like, I'm just going to tell you, like 95% of what we talk about is relevant for any business owner, right? So it's interesting to have that feedback from you, because this January cohort that we're opening up at the end of January to enroll in we call it the business hive. It's like the section of the Therapy in the Great Outdoors community that has the Bedrocks course and all the business templates and the community there for business owners. We're opening enrollment at the end of January. And I had told people that I would reassess whether or not I would open it to more than just pediatric nature-based therapists, kind of based on your experience, because I wanted to make sure that it was helpful to people, even if they were not doing nature-based pediatric therapy. So realistically, it's going to be mostly nature-based peds therapists, but
I mean, I think if people just know that coming in, like it's done through the lens of pediatric nature-based therapy, but I'm consulting and training adults at nature organizations, like not even close. And yet things like how to be organized and how to write things on social media that make sense and communicate well, like that's all universally relevant, Totally. And some of the, the group coaching calls have been so fun, but sometimes some of the questions are not relevant to me. Like, how do I do nature-based therapy in winter? It doesn't matter to me how you do nature-based therapy in winter, but you know what does? How do you go birding with a disability in winter? And so I can pull stuff from that still helps me, or I just look at my emails for 5 minutes and then come back into the call when it's a different question. Like it's not a problem. Like, and I'm also an OT who likes nature, and so it's not irrelevant. I'd so much rather be in this than in a generic business bedrock type course where people are talking about running cafes and stuff. Like that doesn't mean anything to me, know. So like this, it's been so helpful, and I hope you'll let other folks in, because there's so many people who could get good, really important stuff from you and feel empowered. And you know what? Also, listening to your Mind Your OT Business podcast, I almost listened to the entire 3 years of it on a massive book research road trip in July. I drove from Alabama all the way up to Whitefish Point, Michigan, which is like the tippy tip of the Upper Peninsula. And I met you, which was amazing.
That was so fun.
That road trip was when I realized that I was going to do this thing. Your encouragement and how you empower people and your cheerleading of therapists as business owners. I was like, oh, I can do this, and there's a mentor just waiting for me, and this is I can do this thing. Like, how good is this? So
it's so funny, because when we went on that hike, we met when you came through Madison. You had reached out to me on Instagram, and I was like, let's go on a hike and you can show me some birds that I don't know, right? And then it was super rainy and hailing that day, wasn't it? It was kind of crazy. But I remember it's so funny, because I was like, when you ended up enrolling in the hive, when we opened it, I was like, I didn't even think that she would be a client or someone in one of my programs, just because, you weren't a peds therapist. It was kind of we were just meeting up as two therapists interested in nature. And so it's just been such a joy to watch you start this thing and get to kind of see it come to fruition and see you living out these dreams. So anyways, thank you. Thanks for doing this interview, Freya. And thanks for all your kind words. I just really appreciate them. It encourages my heart. And I love the work too. So yeah.
You're very welcome, Laura. None of them, and that's the wrong way of saying that. They are all, I mean them very genuinely. You deserve all the accolades and the thanks and the gratitude. So
wow.
Thank you.
I'm blushing. Well, thanks, Freya. I'm so thankful to you for this time. And this was so fun to talk about. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Laura. It's been a blast.
Bye. Thank you so much for spending time with me today, exploring therapy in the great outdoors. If you liked what you heard in this episode, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes so we can share the magic of nature-based therapy with a wider audience of therapists who work with children who desperately need connection to nature nowadays, just like we do. If you're ready to take the next step in this adventure, join our free Therapy in the Great Outdoors community at therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com. The TGO community is a private space just for nature-based pediatric practitioners. We have loads of resources there to support you as you start or grow a nature-based practice or program. Our free TGO community has a discussion forum, a jobs and volunteers board, a crowdsourced treatment activities section, as well as free video trainings, research article reviews, and book recommendations from yours truly. Head on over to therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com to join today. So until next time, get outside, connect, reflect, and enjoy the business and practice of therapy in the great outdoors.